Collection of talks on Nokodemion's teaching from Contact Report 600's Part 1-3.
Contact Report 606.
Thus, once again, Billy Edward Albert Meyer's prediction has been confirmed. Also, Yoko Ono, the widow of the musician John Lennon, who was murdered in 1980 and ex-Beatles, promotes the organization as a member.
Complete nonviolence. This idea sounds like peace, harmony, and love at first hearing. However, viewed closer or in the light of truth, it is not assertive in the long run, because absolute nonviolence in its one-sided form is not capable of survival. The idea of total nonviolence and the idea that life is possible without any use of logically necessary force is tantamount to a hostile ideology that is incompatible with the laws of nature and life, on which all becoming, life, and decay are based, and is always directed towards the balanced interplay of the poles of positive and negative. In order to make life in positive balance possible at all, the two poles, negative and positive, must always be in a balanced, harmonious balance of forces, whereby a healthy balance of forces or a viable harmony is produced, which fits into the unshakable principles of the laws of nature. As soon as the balance overflows in one direction or the other and threatens to upset the balance of power becomes positive or negative, leading to the destruction of life forms, peace, freedom, harmony, love, etc. in the wild. For example, a wild beast that threatens to extinguish and destroy all other life must be rendered harmless and killed, since it endangers the life and survival of other animal species and people living there. For the natural protection and life support of the other, not degenerate life forms, the snatching beast must therefore be rendered harmless, because it beats out of the natural species and threatens to take all life with it into the abyss, which blends harmoniously into the law of nature and must therefore be protected. The killing of the life-threatening beast is thus an act of emergency for the protection and preservation of all dignified life, whereby the killing in itself is a negative act, but in this case it serves a positive, good purpose and thus corresponds to a positively balanced act of emergency. If, on the other hand, the species of humans become beasts and commit serious crimes, such as the fighters of the IS murderer and butcher gangs, they should nevertheless not be maltreated in the same way as they do to their victims, but should be sent to completely inaccessible places and without any possibility of escape. For example, in the south of Patagonia, left to their own devices for life and exile. Nor should they ever be given the opportunity to return to society again, because degenerate, dehumanized fanatic beasts cannot be treated. In spite of all the horrors, even the worst crimes do not justify the killing of the delinquents, which in turn would amount to murder. These people are also part of the evolution of their consciousness, and must be allowed to learn from their misdeeds, even if it seems hopeless. The work of the unmistakable, life-giving creative laws and commandments is directed toward love, but not toward revenge and retaliation, even if some vengeance and retaliation cries do not make this fact clear. A complete and unconditional nonviolence, however, is never feasible and not compatible with the laws of life, but sooner or later inevitably leads to doom. Through unconditional nonviolence, a way of life, a group, a society, a people, a humanity, etc., becomes incapable of fighting itself and offers no resistance to an aggressive attacker, which is tantamount to a cowardly and stupid act of self-destruction, or an act of non-intentional throwing away of one's own life. There is then a positive degeneration, through which a life form defenselessly exposes itself to every attack and thus evokes its downfall itself. In a sense, life is always a struggle, at least as far as the preservation of one's own livelihoods is concerned, including adequate defense against attacks of all kinds. A logical nonviolence, on the other hand, stands for a kind of passive violence that is carried out actively or violently, but without physical violence, but only in the sense of passive resistance without any bloodshed, torture or terror, etc. This logical force is an appropriate means to change adverse circumstances or to remove incompetent leaders of peoples and states from office, whereby through a determined unity, inflexibility, and clarity of purpose of the people of a people, everything can be achieved without loss of human life that must be done to establish a real democracy or to create a real peace. Dictators, incompetent governments, and despots can only become great and powerful, gain power over the people, and continue their misanthropic actions if the people of the people allow this through their passivity, cowardice, and fear, and surrender their responsibility without will. Moreover, a vague notion of general nonviolence is not enough to change undemocratic conditions, replace errant leaders, and bring about peace. In addition to the consensus of the people already mentioned, this requires above all a clear goal about what is to be achieved and which means are effective. If, for example, a true democracy is to be achieved in this way, each individual person of the people must also take full responsibility for it, and must clearly and unambiguously see to it that the goal of a true democracy is achieved, and must stand up for what should then be striven for with all available peaceful means and achieved to the end. This, however, not with brute force, coercion, war, and bloodshed, but with iron unity and determination in the exercise of a passive resistance which forces the irresponsible in power to give up their position and their power, and to hand over the full determination over all concerns to the people. This requires a lot of time, patience, and perseverance on the part of people who are truly democratically oriented. Quote from Billy Edgeworth Albert Meyer's Richness of Nonviolence and Deep Spiritual Explanations, 7th November 2012. The teaching of the Spirit, the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life, teaches with special emphasis love, compassion, peace, knowledge, wisdom, joy, happiness, freedom, and harmony. The teaching offers a great wealth of thoughts and feelings and also teaches nonviolence and all unique and at the same time lasting means to attain life security. All people can benefit from this teaching, learn and experience that true love and compassion are the essential cornerstones in which the whole building of behavior in life is founded. It is taught that hurting, destroying, and destroying life is of complete deviance and contrary to all creative natural laws and commandments. To inflict suffering or pain on a human being or any other living being in malevolence, and without the need for self-defense or to harm him or her in any way, is not only to be avoided under all circumstances, but also against the entire creative and natural laws and recommendations. This applies to all forms of life, from the highest to the lowest, from the most consciously developed human being to the lowest insect and bacterium. Even the life of the lowest bacterium can only be fought if it is necessary, for example, in the case of diseases. Even the lowest bacterium has a life purpose and is part of the overall evolution of all life and all things, so it can only be fought when it is necessary. The creative natural laws and commandments teach that suffering, pain, or harm should not be inflicted on any being, but that everything should be directed in such a way that peaceful coexistence can exist. Achim Wolff, Germany.
Contact Report 609.
In addition, a few important sentences from An Open Word by Billy Figu, Wasser Manzeit Verlag.
But as ever, the truthful prophet Muhammad never had time to write down his teachings and his warnings and prophecies personally, so he instructed his cousin to do it. But he interpreted everything wrongly at his own discretion and wrote it down in such a falsified way that Muhammad's teaching came to even worse shame than it had done about 500 years before with Emmanuel's teaching through his brother James and through Paulus Saulus and the disciples Luke, Matthew, Mark, and John. The truthful prophet Muhammad was compelled to act in the known form in order to counteract the traditional idolatrous false doctrines as well as Judaism and Christianity in the main. This predetermined course of action alone, the betrayal of irreligious beliefs, ensured that the then prevailing religions of blood and hatred, as well as the delusional religion of Christianity, did not become so prevalent that within a few centuries they would have dominated the entire earthly humanity, to such an extent that earthly humanity, completely blinded by its sectarian religions, would have destroyed itself without any mercy whatsoever through immense and worldwide religious sect wars. So the Prophet Muhammad had to appear and bring the teaching of the truth of the Spirit another time, this time outside of the intended series of teaching offerings. So he appeared as a true prophet outside his normal cycle, dutiful and aware that he would be persecuted and accused of lying as ever. Nevertheless, he complied with his duty, as he had done since time immemorial, and as he fulfilled his duty in his revival as Enoch, Eliah, Josiah, Jeremiah, and Emmanuel, as true prophet who, always true to the laws and commandments of creation, proclaimed the truthful teaching of truth and spirit.
Contact Report 614.
I have talked about this with Quetzal, and we both think that your proposal is acceptable. Therefore, not a 250-kilometer limit should be valid, but to determine the radius the city of Munich in Germany. This is common sense, and is also feasible for core group members, as you say that driving up to the AGM days within this radius is still reasonable. And what you define with Eurasia is what we mean.
Exactly, that's what I am thinking, with which there is clarity now. Then the following. With regard to the imprinting and the meaning of the mission as silent revolution of the truth, as it was called by Icarina, ambiguities obviously prevail. Consequently, I was approached with the question of what was to be understood by it. I have written the following statement. By silent revolution of the truth, it is to be understood that every person who turns to the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life deals with it and learns from it quietly in himself, in order to comprehend what has been learned and understood in life, to carry it out and carry it out effectively by learning the truth given in reality, and by carrying out in an inner way, so to speak, a silent revolution in order to assert oneself to the true life, to the reality and to the creative natural laws and commandments, to carry them out and to live according to them. In this way, the learner, who turns to the teaching of the Spirit and thus to the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life, creates or carries out in himself in a very personal way, a silent revolution of the truth.
Since I have been involved with the machinations of this criminal organization since its inception, I can only confirm what you say. The whole of the Scientology sect's endeavor, however, is not based solely on the establishment of a totalitarian world social order, but on the fact that a secret striving for effective world domination is prescribed, which is to encompass absolute control over all governments and authorities as well as armies, secret services, and the entire economy. And in order to achieve this sect regards no means as too small, too difficult, or severe. Consequently, even the worst capital crimes have to be considered.
I am aware of that. But as long as the governments and authorities and the economic bosses and so on reach out to this cult and allow it to go ahead, or even belong to this criminal organization themselves, nothing will improve and everything will only get worse. If all these responsible persons were to turn to the spiritual doctrine and learn the real, what life and evolution demand, then neither religions, sects, false philosophies, false worldviews, and especially such criminal psycho-sects as Scientology would no longer exist. And with regard to the doctrine of the mind, I would like to say the following. The doctrine of truth, doctrine of the mind, doctrine of life is in no way in the tradition of a religion, philosophy, or any of its sects, or a purely secular faith, but is based on reality and its truth, as well as on the creative natural laws and commandments. This teaching, also called spiritual teaching for short, expresses extensively the facts of reality and its truth, as well as those of the spiritual concerns and of life, as well as the creative natural laws and commandments, which were already recognized at very early times by the universal prophet Nokodemion, and can be realized by every human being in life, if he honestly turns to the teaching, learns it comprehensively, and consciously implements it. The doctrine of truth, doctrine of the spirit, doctrine of life is thus founded in creative natural truths which are given in reality, and which also make it clear that man has at his disposal a tiny part of the spirit of creation which enlivens him as a spiritual form, and is capable of reincarnation, which also states that man in his existence is a being which is not limited to just one life, but through many new incarnations lives on again and again as new personalities. This means that not the human being as such, but only his spiritual form is reincarnated or reborn, while the human being passes away in death as such with his consciousness and personality, and is transformed into a new, neutral energy, from which a new consciousness with a new personality is created by the total block of consciousness created by the spiritual form in the afterlife area. The new personality is then born into the new human body on the 21st day after the conception of a new human body, together and at the same moment in which the spiritual form also reincarnates into the new body, namely into the collicula superior in the roof of the midbrain, Chuck's paired nodal point, whereby the physical body, and thus also the consciousness, is enlivened, and the pure instinctual state of the fetus, which existed until then for 21 days, is awakened to effective life. This enables the new human being or his new consciousness with his new personality to develop, whereby in the course of time after birth, he can effectively exceed all possibilities he thinks he has. Through the proper functioning of his consciousness and thoughts, he will not only be able to solve all his personal problems and achieve his self-imposed goals, but he will actually be able to expand his consciousness and create knowledge, wisdom, and love, as well as balance and peace, freedom and harmony within himself and for his environment. The doctrine of truth, doctrine of the spirit, doctrine of life teaches that man is good according to his innermost creative natural being, but that he himself shapes his inner being according to his own free will, which he then also releases to the outside. Thus he determines his consciousness and his material life himself, according to his thoughts, feelings, and his views, opinions, and attitudes. Thus everything depends on himself and is shaped as he wants it to be according to his own will. This is also the case with regard to relations and dealings, as well as equality with regard to fellow human beings, nature and its fauna and flora, but also the orientation towards the universe, and thus also the creative natural laws and commandments. In this respect, the doctrine of the mind, that is to say, the doctrine of truth, doctrine of the mind, doctrine of life is not a religion, sect, philosophy, and no worldly belief, but effectively, in the truest sense of the word, the doctrine of truth, with the indisputable truth of reality, that is to say, reality. Man must learn to perceive his innermost being and to do nothing less than consciously obey the creative natural laws and commandments which are pressing within him, and to put into practice the abilities he has gained in this way, in the certainty of absolute correctness in life. Thus man is able to free himself from all evil and negativity that he has learned through wrong education and self-education in his life. And if he does this, then he also frees himself from all other evils, and as an individual helps his fellow men to do the same and to lead a creative, natural, lawful life. And if this spreads to humanity, then the possibility arises that it will renounce all madness such as war, brutality, violence, crime, and coercion, that it will finally become peaceful, and that all those people who enable themselves to do the progressive and the great for all earthly humanity can do so. And if this happens, then all people will also have the same rights and will be able to enjoy true peace and effective freedom and harmony. The truth is that only the doctrine of the Spirit, or the doctrine of truth, doctrine of the Spirit, doctrine of life has preserved all the genuine values of true love, freedom, peace, and harmony, unadulterated throughout all times, and has also received the hope for them. This, while all religions, sects, Philosophies and secular faiths have disregarded these values since time immemorial and allowed them to degenerate through murder, manslaughter, punishments, and wars, as well as through lies, deception, exploitation, subjugation, and slavery. Thus, earthly mankind was never free from misery, suffering, and pain, but lived in it the opposite way and was trapped in every way by its dictated inhuman machinations. Nokodemion's doctrine of truth, doctrine of the spirit, doctrine of life has taught the contrary since time immemorial, that man should be without such limitations, and that he should achieve his human goals of the evolution of consciousness without restrictions imposed on him, and find his way into the true creative life, namely without influences of religious, sectarian, philosophical, or worldly forms of faith, but only through reality and its unique and unshakable truth. And the spiritual doctrine teaches that man must not omit what is right in order to find the way to true life, in which no religious, sectarian, or philosophical god can find a place, but only reality and the effective truth that results from it. Truly, the great majority of all earthly mankind has always harbored the hope that world peace will finally come, as well as world freedom and harmony. And this hope is as strong today as it has always been, despite all the murderous wars, uprisings, human slaughter, and catastrophes that raged and brought untold misery and suffering to countless people on earth, as well as immense destruction. And the hope of the people of earth is very old and unbroken, that all these monstrosities will finally come to an end, but this hope can only be fulfilled if it is finally found to the doctrine of truth, doctrine of the spirit, doctrine of life, and thus to the creative natural reality and truth, and if its laws and commandments are also perceived and obeyed. But this requires a turning away from religions, gods, sects, false philosophies, and equally false worldviews. Only when this happens does an understanding of people arise with regard to the effective truth, which arises solely from reality or reality.
Contact Report 618.
Exactly, that's what I'm talking about. But now I want to talk about something which I myself have always bumped up against, namely the term prophet, which is also foisted upon me, and about which I am not at all pleased. If I have made prophecies, then I have simply proclaimed or even prophesied these, hence one could maybe call me proclaimer or prophesizer. And if I now fulfill the mission and bring the teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the life, then one can call me mission fulfiller, or plainly and simply teacher, in which case this naming even appeals to me, but prophet not at all. The term prophet is unfortunately quite ancient, and based on the fact that former proclaimers of prophecies were simply called as such, not however according to what the real reason of their work was, precisely the teaching of the spiritual teaching, that is to say, the teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the life. Hence the prophecies fundamentally proclaimed the bringer of the teaching, and therefore were teachers, just as I see myself as such, and not as a prophet. I have made only a few prophecies, and also make only a few such today, whereby it is also to be noted that prophecies as a rule are based on probability calculations, dreams and visions, which can both fulfill themselves as well as not be fulfilled, and indeed according to how the causes have been dealt with, and the corresponding effects proceeding from them, follow. Therefore, the prophecies are changeable. This completely in contrast to predictions, such I've indeed made many, and which undoubtedly also fulfill themselves in each case. And if one wanted, therefore, according to these, instead of calling me prophet, then predictor would probably apply. Thus, the designation prophet, I find, has something objectionable, religious, and sectarian in itself, quite the contrary to it or to teacher, which is also why this is a reason for me that I reject this term. I have also spoken about it with Ava and Bernadette, who both are also of the opinion that for me one should simply use the designation teacher, because prophet is really characterized very strongly in a religious sectarian wise, as I also am of the same opinion.
What you say, I can understand. and indeed also with regard to the fact that your words correspond to the rightness. By you saying that the term prophet is to be interpreted religious sectarianly because since time immemorial and up into the present time, someone is thus described by the earth human who has fallen into a purely religious or a sectarian belief and feels called upon by their God to proclaim the godly truth as a prophetic admonisher and seer. In this wise, such a human being of earth will be recognized, treated, and often also worshipped and adored by the religious and sectarian believers as a religious authority. However, in the sense of the bringing, teaching, and communicating of the spiritual teaching, that is to say, the teaching of the prophets, that is to say, the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life, there is solely and exclusively the teaching, but no prophecies. However, might beyond the bringing of the teaching of the teacher's prophetic statements or effective predictions, then these do not stand in direct connection with the teaching, but in relation to logical thinking with regard to combinations of happenings, probability calculations, real dreams, and real visions. Nevertheless, all these values are not based in the teaching, but in the consciousness-based capabilities of the prophesying and predictive person. The origin of the term prophet, however, is found in the ancient Greek language, namely in the word prophets, which means, for example, proclaimer of oracular sayings, as well as seer and soothsayer. In the term prophetess, it amounts to two pieced-together words, pro, which means before, and pheme, which is to be interpreted as speech or speaking. Furthermore, from this the term phanai follows, which means so much as speaking, from which in turn follows the term propanai, which is to be understood as predict or proclaim. The whole thing was already adopted very early from Christianity and from Islam and implemented in all the languages of the believers who belonged to these religions and their sects, which was thus retained until the present day and has general validity in all decisive fields of language. With regard to the spiritual teaching, teaching of the prophets, that is to say, teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life, as well as naming those human beings who bring, teach, and spread this teaching, the term teacher should fundamentally be used, as you have also said this yourself. Also, the terms prophet or mission fulfiller could be used, as also, nevertheless, prophesier. If the corresponding teacher just makes prophecies, which clearly puts the possibilities of coming happenings and so forth, if set causes are pursued further and cannot someday be changed for the better, therefore they ultimately lead to the prophesied effects. Only in this sense can a prophesizer person be seen and understood. If they are called as prophet or prophetess, or come forth as a male or female proclaimer, admonisher, caller, and seer, as well as warner. However, what now results from this? That one calls yourself a prophet, is thus based simply in the fact that you've made and also continue to make diverse prophecies, if you so desire it, but this designation may be absolutely omitted for your person and your work, because the whole of this term does not correspond to what you are effectively doing, namely teaching and spreading the spiritual teaching. That is to say, the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life. Therefore, plainly and simply, you should rightly also be called teacher. And this designation should also be taken into account, even though you have made certain prophecies, and that you have also made a great number of predictions as a predictor, that over the course of time have fulfilled as well and continue to fulfill themselves, just as also certain prophecies. That also does not change the fact that you are a teacher of the spiritual teaching, that is to say, the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life, and teach and spread this teaching. Thus, you should also be referred to as teacher and as nothing else.
Contact Report 626.
This is all extremely annoying, but in terms of exact clarifications in the center area, if we were to carry out such clarifications, they would really be very time-consuming. This is in addition to the fact that, according to our directives, it would not be permissible outside the direct vibration protection area of the center to find a person in question and name him or her, and that he or she could be punished. According to our directives, we are not allowed to interfere in such matters, such as the fact that we would carry out investigations on our own initiative and bring guilty persons directly or indirectly to punishment. Such action on our part would be tantamount to unauthorized intervention and interference in the affairs, concerns, laws and rights of another world or a foreign state, which, however, is forbidden by our directives, which for us means strict law. Consequently, we do not violate them in any way, which has also prevented our Playaran peoples from falling into any conflicts with foreign worlds or states for decades. So, of course, we also adhere to our directives on Earth, which must be understood and followed as legislations, and which also guarantee that we Playaran would never exercise and carry out warlike, conquering or otherwise military machinations on foreign worlds or in foreign states. So even though we Playaran are equipped with very effective weapons, which have no equal on Earth and are so superior to all Earth weapons of any kind, and so highly futuristic for Earth humans that they themselves have not the slightest objection to them, we never use them for purposes of aggression, offensive actions, or conquest. If necessary, however, we use them for defense, in which case we act exclusively according to the traditional rules and regulations of the Nokodemion directives or laws, which stipulate that only nonviolence by force may be used without exception, which also stipulates that enemies or culprits may only be put out of action by suitable non-lethal means, and may only be killed in direct self-defense. We Playaran have not engaged in offensive warfare or other military actions for tens of millennia, just as we have not been forced to engage in defensive actions in this regard for thousands of years. However, if offensive actions were to occur against us, we would of course respond and act defensively, but strictly in accordance with our directives or laws, which prescribe non-violence by force in every case, as you described in detail during our last official 625th conversation on the 15th of August. And what remains to be explained is the following. Our self-chosen or desired by peoples and worlds, tasks on other worlds, so also on Earth, are on the one hand always and thus without exception of an observing, investigating, and peaceful nature. On the other hand, however, in certain cases also in a form of secret impulsive aid to development and progress, if the respective state of development of the peoples concerned is given for this purpose. Thus, in a voluntary, pleasing and altruistic way, we are active in terms of development impulses with regard to medicine, technology, and other sciences, as well as the teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life, as well as with regard to the living together of human beings in a family, acquaintance, friendship, community, as well as with regard to the manifestations, developments, and laws of the social life of states, peoples, and worlds.
These remarks and explanations bring an open and strong light to your presence on Earth. It had been asked long and often in this regard, but I thought that without a question to that effect you should speak of it once, which you have now done.
Good. If we start from your mission of denunciation, then on the one hand, it is to be noted that you work in two ways. First of all, by pointing out to Earth humans as much and as often as possible all that is degenerate, evil, unworthy of human beings, negative, unjust and reprehensible, etc., etc., the prophecies, forecasts, and predictions, as well as the probability calculations and all other possibilities given to you, offer you the opportunity to do this, whereby you can record and elaborate everything in writing in very good language and writing style, in order to then pass on everything in the form of articles, brochures, and bulletins, etc., to Earth humans who are interested in it. In a good way, the Internet is also available to you nowadays, where you can post all your written missionary work and make it accessible to all interested people around the world. And this work of producing articles, brochures, bulletins and signs of the times, etc., as well as publishing and pointing out on the Internet all kinds of negative things and unworthy things that are happening all over the world and also appear as degenerations of Earth humans' behavior, is of great importance and significance. If positive things, articles, letters, and descriptions are also given in smaller publications, then this is not harmful, but loosens things up a little and helps the readership to compare the negative and the positive and to learn from them. On the other hand, you have written a large number of articles, books and small writings in relation to the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, and thus in a missionary value positive form, which are distributed worldwide through sales, and which stand as a value positive counterbalance to the negative aspects of the articles, bulletins, brochures, and time signs posted on the Internet. And all these works exceed many times over the value of all the negative outlooks, expectations, perspectives, prophecies, probability calculations, forecasts, and predictions posted on the Internet. The fact is that these two forms, the negative and the positive, must be kept as separate as possible and must not be mixed too much, because each form has its own special effect on Earth humans, and only in this way can it bring success in terms of insight, understanding, and transformation for the better and the good. It is only when the opposites meet that a useful reaction results which is directed towards the good, positive and correct being recognized and separated from the ungood, negative, and incorrect, and that the whole can ultimately be brought to a balancing factor and thus to an evolutionary value.
That is just what I am thinking. But how about private persons and figu groups, etc., translating articles and booklets into foreign languages according to your instructions, while books are nevertheless excluded, which should afterwards be uploaded to the Internet by the private persons and figu groups, etc.? Should we from the parent center then create links on our website towards the externally loaded pages in national languages, that is to say translations?
Of course, because it is so necessary that all those humans of the earth come into contact with the respective important and instructive facts of the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life, which are on the one hand written and distributed by you, and on the other hand also by members of the core group and interested parties. That is, so to say, important, because via it, the humans of the earth attention are drawn to the reality and its truth, are able to recognize these and can learn from it. Spreading the teaching in this way and meeting a good way of the mission is very good, and constitutes by no means a proselytization and infiltration with respect to the humans of the earth, because those are neither directly nor indirectly exposed to an urging, and thus everyone is left with his own free will and own interest as well as personal decision.
Contact Report 631.
Exactly. So I find the assertions of this book writer Hamed Abdel Samad quite idiotic, although I have to appease the fact that he cannot know what the reality and truth concerning Muhammad is. In the same situation of ignorance is of course also the Islam scientist Muhammad Khorshida. He only knows the Quran as it exists today, and which does not correspond to what Muhammad effectively taught as a messenger, namely exactly the same teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, as the messengers Emmanuel, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Elijah, and Enoch taught them. And this teaching was put down on paper extensively on my part, and that already from the year 1975, whereby it is spread worldwide since then, whereby the main works, like the OM and Goblet of Truth, together with several dozen further books, contain a teaching material which actually cannot be completely studied and effectively not converted by a human being in a single life alone. And when the author now negates the teaching that Muhammad has brought, then he insults the messenger and the teaching that he has brought, and that has hardly anything in common with the Quran, which Muhammad did not write, but writers who, on the one hand, wrote some things on his behalf, but falsified everything. This, on the other hand, while others wrote the Quran long after Muhammad, as it exists today as an end product, but in its entirety, it has little or nothing to do with the real teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, that Muhammad and all the other preachers of the Nokodemion lineage taught.
The falsehoods that the man puts forward with regard to Muhammad and his teachings correspond to a slanderous shamefulness, for Muhammad never taught falsehoods and evil. The other statements in the Quran that exist today are based on untruths that have arisen through false interpretations or deliberate falsifications of the writers, all of whom lived long after Muhammad, so that they themselves did not hear his words of doctrine and knew only from hearsay concerning falsified oral traditions, or could write the Quran through their own fiction. That alone corresponds to the truth. Consequently, the writing of Hamed Abdel Samad corresponds to a shamefulness towards the honor and dignity, as well as the teaching and task of the Prophet Muhammad, even if the author does not know what is effective reality and truth regarding Muhammad and the teaching.
Probably he thinks very wisely, but for himself, wise thinkers, there is an old Nokodemion theorem, which says the following: he who presents himself as wise and displays wisdom, but is not wise, does not thereby become wise, but remains stuck in his imprudence, learns nothing valuable, and gradually falls into stupidity.
Contact Report 632.
I, too, deal with earthly concerns in this regard, as well as with making probability calculations with regard to one and the other facts, but not in order to make predictions or prophecies. With regard to the question whether an Islamization in Europe, or even sometime the introduction of the Sharia, is to be feared, it can be said that this will not be the case, because the European coinage of mentality and religiosity is too strong to be overgrown by Islam. Surely women in Europe do not have to wear a burqa or a chador, nor do they have to wear the fact that fiqh books and writings should not be distributed because they do not conform to Sharia law. The fiqh books and writings in no way denigrate Islam, but are in conformity with the teachings of Muhammad, which he taught in the form of the and Goblet of the Truth, and with the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life. Unfortunately, however, his teaching is not truly preserved and handed down in the form in which he taught it, which is why it is now directly recorded and taught in writing for all the future. In this way, falsifications can no longer occur because the teaching is taught directly in writing in books, articles, brochures, and small scripts, without falsification in the original word. In former times, all technical possibilities were lacking for this. Consequently, the doctrine was from time immemorial only taught orally by the proclaimers, whereas for the experts of Scripture it was the task to write down the offered doctrine, which, however, always led to great falsifications. Because the proclaimers of Scripture interpreted and falsified the scientists according to their own discretion. Consequently, only very little of the real doctrine remained reasonably analogous and was handed down to the present day. Well, also with regard to the question of whether people in Europe will turn to Islam in the future, it can be said that this will not be the case even if European religious and sect aberrations turn to Islam,
as is unfortunately always the case with so-called God-seekers and God-believers, because they are deluded into believing that the God of another religion or sect, as well as the teachings and ritual acts and regulations, are better, fairer, and more humane, etc. But there are other confused and delusional misconceptions as well. As far as the threat of the Islamist State is concerned, it is very great because it is constantly increasing because of the refugee system, namely because Islamist sleepers, and thus murderous adventurers and fanatics, are uncontrollably smuggled into Europe and other states, where they can then bring their deadly mischief to bear. And the fact that this can happen in Europe, I have no choice but to say this, is due to the stupidity, hatred, revenge, and boundless irresponsibility of German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who paved the way for this human catastrophe. This is a fact that causes both the German people and the peoples of the states of the dictatorial European Union to revolt and provokes malignant unrest, which may lead to civil war-like uprisings, for which not much is lacking according to the current state of the refugee disaster. On the one hand, and on the other hand, various states of the European Union are forced, for the good of their own country and its people, to take drastic violent countermeasures, be it, as it has been done for weeks, by erecting border fences and keeping refugees from entering the country, or be it by direct use of force with regard to the refugees. And with regard to the refugees, it should also be mentioned that our extensive investigations have shown that the majority of all refugees are not real refugees, to the detriment of the real refugees, but leave their homeland only because, through the propaganda via public media, that all refugees are welcome in Germany and Europe and are cared for in every good way. All the people are tempted by Angela Merkel to flee their country and flee to Europe, to be cared for by the state in every imaginable way, cared for and, if desired, provided with all luxury goods. We know this by listening to many conversations of the so-called refugees, who in their naivety believe the lies and false promises of Angela Merkel, who wants to ruin Germany, as it is also in the interest of other power-hungry people in the EU government. But the German people know nothing of the fact that their country will be shamefully betrayed in this way and will be pushed off the pedestal. That must still be said. And as far as the IS is concerned now, it is presently and also in the near future very questionable whether it will be possible that the Islamist state can be finally dissolved by the USA and its allies as well as by the Russians, as is also the case with other fanatical terrorist organizations, criminal syndicates and their followers. In this regard, one has to think, for example, of the Nazi system, from which the almost worldwide neo-Nazitum has developed, as well as of the U.S. Ku Klux Klan, the Sicilian Italian, American and Russian Mafia, the Japanese Yakuza and Al-Qaeda, etc., which have existed for many decades and which the law, the police, the security forces, and the military cannot control and dissolve these organizations. These are the facts, how I see and understand them, and how I have worked them out from my probability calculations.
Contact Report 636.
The Quran, however, is not based on the effective message of the Prophet Muhammad, but largely unearthed human falsifications of doctrine, points of view, and false laws, etc., which were gathered together and cobbled together long after Muhammad's death, and which have very little or nothing to do with Muhammad's doctrine, which unfortunately is not generally known to Islam believers. In fact, they do not know that what Muhammad taught is the teaching of truth, the teaching of the Spirit, the teaching of life. From the word Muslim, the meaning is derived, for example, the one who professes to Islam or who surrenders in Allah God. Thus, this term is applicable for the followers of the religion Islam. Basically, according to the understanding of Islam, the person who pronounces the Islamic confession of faith, the Shahada, in front of witnesses and thus publicly is a Muslim according to religious law, whereby the believer expresses himself and says, "I testify that there is no God except Allah God, and that Muhammad is the messenger of God." It should also be said that if the term salam, which belongs to the same root and means salvation or peace, is included in the definition of the term Islam, then it is a word which is linguistically closely related to the Hebrew shalom, or peace. And
Contact Report 642.
I'm aware of the misunderstanding at that time, so I want to give a new explanation, but it has to be said that the whole of what has been said should be clear. But if it is not understood by various Earth humans, then this may be because they have an incomplete understanding of language, which is neither our nor your own. If there was talk of a new people, then Quetzal spoke in the sense of a people according to how Nokodemion formed a people in the way he did, by making planetary efforts to teach people the teaching of the truth, the teaching of the spirit, the teaching of the life. So it happened that a lot of human beings all over the planet joined Nokodemion, but stayed in their homeland and learned just the spiritual doctrine. In this way, they formed a planet-wide spiritual doctrine people, as it was called by Nokodemion, and known in this way, which is recorded in our annals according to tradition. So it was not a nation of one country or state, but a planet-wide spiritual doctrine nation, which lived openly and freely worldwide in various places and learned and lived the spiritual doctrine. However, such a people could also be called together in one place for certain purposes to carry out a certain mission, which Nokodemion did, for example, to create peace and unity and to take action against aggressors when the need required. Thus, such a spiritual doctrinal people consisted of people of the most diverse countries, cultures, and races, who, however, dealt uniformly with the spiritual doctrine, and thus formed a people as willing spiritual teachers, whereby such a spiritual doctrinal people effectively formed a multi-ethnic people and could in no way be compared with an organization because an effective people existed. In the same sense, a new people is also to be understood, to be founded, as Quetzal said. And as you yourself mentioned at that time, it is true that such a new spiritual doctrine people should be created in its origin by the Fi-Gu, and thus in Nokodemion manner. This means that according to Quetzal, the core group members of the Fi-Gu are the real origin of the new people who gathered and began to work and spread the mission. Through constantly new group members and their descendants, as you have said, the new people should then come together, whereby of course this meant the formation and appearance of the passive members and their descendants. And so it happened, because the new people of the humanities has already begun to form worldwide since 1975, that is to say, not only since 1981, and today has a considerable number of students of the humanities, that is to say, a small people of the humanities. Consequently, the Quetzal words, "a new people has to be founded slowly but surely become reality,"
which has to come true, because ancient prophecies are interpreted in this way. Although they are prophecies, there is a lot more to it in this direction than was actually to be expected. When I consider that several mission-related books and many articles by core group and passive group members exist and are read and studied worldwide, that alone is a good mission success. And for my part, I should have written only 8 books concerning the spiritual doctrine, and only worked in Europe in the German-speaking area. But now there are more than 60 books, several hundred articles, and many small writings from my work. Basically, however, I have to say that the whole thing could not have been achieved without all my faithful people, because they were always faithful to me in everything and did a lot of work. Even in my bad times when the family terror was with my ex and the assassinations were committed against me, they stood by me and helped me stay on course. Of course, you have also contributed a lot to this, which I absolutely will not forget. But also the mission has spread worldwide, as in various European countries, from the north to the south, as well as in South America, Mexico, Canada, the USA, Saudi Arabia, India, Korea, Russia, Japan, China, Hong Kong, and Australia, as well as New Zealand, and I know where else. The passive group is growing, albeit slowly, but continuously, which is not the case with the core group.
What you say about your faithful is probably true. But without you doing the most important thing yourself and allowing yourself to be discouraged and depressed, what was created would never have come into being. Be it with the construction of the center, which has become a small paradise, as well as with regard to the creation of books and writings and the worldwide spread of the mission. The core group is probably the most important factor with regard to the work with regard to the mission, whereby its worldwide activity resulted from the detour via your pictures of our beam ships and thus of ufology. This had not been foreseen in this form and to this extent, but it was very valuable for the expansion and spread of the mission, and the whole thing spread rapidly to many states. Unfortunately, on the other hand, there is the fact mentioned by you that there is a lack of core group members, and that new core group candidates are rarely interested in mission and core group work, and thus in core group membership, because various people who would be capable of core group work and could also reach the center in a short time prefer to indulge in their pleasures and unimportant and even worthless personal desires. Some of these individuals unfortunately shy away from core group commitments, or find themselves unable enough to fulfill fee-goo obligations. Hence, they are more likely to perform a short 3-day work assignment or financial contribution per year. Further, it is to be said that unfortunately also again and again, unjustified attacks in the form of slander against you and the fee-goo as well as the association members, on the one hand by outside strangers, as on the other hand, however, also by some of your family or those belong to it. Since the core group itself was founded in 1975, it has repeatedly emerged that members have joined the core group, but have left it again, even after 30 years of membership, and that was the best thing about it. This was because they were selfish, because sooner or later they no longer wanted to fit into the regulations of the statutes, and thus no longer into the good order and unanimous resolutions of the General Assemblies, for which they cited the strangest and unreal as well as incomprehensible assertions and reasons. As a rule, their willingness to rule and non-insertion into order played a role, as did the fact that they did not take the reins into their own hands, did not hold the scepter, did not preside, did not determine the members, did not instruct them, did not lead them, and did not attune them to their wrong opinions. Several members who left the core group complained that the leadership of the fee-goo, that is to say you, the board and all members, who decide unanimously at the General Assembly, is not absolutistic, patronizing, dictatorial, but indulgent, democratic, patient, considerate, and tolerant. For my part, I myself have gone to the bottom of every single case and have noticed that mainly and primarily you are maliciously slandered by such former members of the laxity and inability of the leadership of the association. Secondly, however, also the board, and finally all group members. However, as Quetzal, I and our board are able to clearly judge your and the board's conduct in all matters in accordance with our observations, findings, analyses, and records. The conduct of you and the board is absolutely impeccable in all respects. It should also be added that all members who have unswervingly committed themselves to the mission and thus voluntarily committed themselves to you and persevere with you are special people and faithful companions. And I will say this once as a contrast to those who shamefully set themselves apart, even if they were in the figu for many years and for selfish reasons did not want to refrain from their lust for power, self-assertion and stepping outside on the other members, and also did not want to accept the rules of order of the statutes and statutes.
Contact Report 643.
The abolition of armaments and all weapons alone is not enough to create a lasting and effective peace. Peace, as you have said, also presupposes justice, as well as that not one people dominates, subjugates, exploits, or even plunders the other and lives at its expense. And as you have also said, there must be no class being within a people. Every human community must be such that all human beings, without distinction, are on the same level, and one level must not oppress, exploit, or dominate the other. It can only be a wise guidance, but it must be correct and prudent and guide everything comprehensively for the good of all. And by this I mean a leadership that effectively leads and guides the people or peoples in the sense of the term leading, but does not stand above the people and rule them. For governing, in our sense, means directing and ruling, which means that in relation to human beings, these are directed and controlled according to the will of another human being or their several others. In fact, the entire earthly population still needs to make very great efforts in terms of democracy, solidarity and the sharing of solidarity in order to achieve true peace, equality and equal rights among all human beings on earth, including women and men. The promises repeatedly made by earthly politicians and governments that they would work for the peace of peoples and their freedom, as well as that they would endeavor to promote the worldwide disarmament of weapons and weapons systems, and to use the conversion of weapons for peaceful, protective and security purposes, truthfully only leads to the appearance of warlike, revolutionary, and terrorist machinations. On the one hand, this is due to the fact that elements willing to revolt, war, and upheaval feel challenged to want to change everything according to their wicked will with naked force of arms. On the other hand, the arms industry feels obliged to produce its weapons and weapon systems and sell them to countries that long for them because they can defend and retain their dictatorial power. And they want to do this before real facts of peace are created. So a decree is also needed in relation to the manufacture of weapons and weapons systems, which prohibits the manufacture and sale of weapons to states which use them to terrorize their own people or to carry out arms operations against other countries. However, the whole thing must also be directed by a decree towards the fact that even privately, only persons of absolute integrity may acquire and possess weapons that pose no danger whatsoever to their fellow human beings. The mere threat that this or that person should be threatened with a weapon, or even hugged or killed, no matter what he or she has done, should be a reason for a ban on weapons, because people who make such threats are unpredictable and absolutely irresponsible towards life, and therefore have no weapons in their hands. The very thought of threatening, harassing, or killing oneself or another person with a weapon is irresponsible and criminal, and no weapon belongs in the hands of such a person. The use of weapons against human beings may only be justified in an absolute emergency to protect one's own life or that of another, and may only be used fatally in the very last emergency if there is no other possibility. The worldwide motive of hope of the terrestrial people, with regard to the disarmament and conversion of weapons and weapon systems, is absolutely fruitless if a real peace is not created in the framework you and I have mentioned, whereby first of all the people must create peace among themselves before a peace of the peoples, and finally a world peace can be considered. However, the march of the highly armed peoples is still being consciously pursued, and the majority of those responsible for the state are only making great and stupid speeches with regard to peace negotiations, as well as doing nothing for a worldwide birth ban and comprehensive birth control. Peace negotiations will continue to come to nothing. This, on the one hand, because they are not meant seriously by the majority of politicians and rulers, and on the other hand, because the more people populate Earth, the more elements promote the insurrection, the unrest, the revolt, and terror, as well as the warfare, which ultimately leads to anarchy. And this alone, because the human being on Earth becomes more and more unrelated to his fellow human beings, as well as egoistic, unscrupulous and thoughtlessly unfeeling and more self-centered, does not want to treat the others anymore, and degenerates into stinginess. And all these evils prevent that peace can generally become among Earth humans, but also because everyone only still thinks and acts for himself, and neither real personal love nor neighborly love are present, and what still exists in this respect is becoming more and more atrophied. Thus every old-fashioned promise of salvation, as it is preached by unrealistic religions and sects, becomes ridiculous, not least because these institutions only speak stupidly and desperately, without instructing people how and what they have to learn in order to really live according to the creative natural laws and commandments. Religions and sects do not teach people that they must first and foremost create peace, freedom and harmony in themselves before they can pass on these values, so that their fellow human beings can also learn from them and become harmonious and balanced, peacefully, liberally, and in all their thoughts and feelings as well as in their actions and actions. Even the ancient prophets and wise men taught that all war armor should be forged into agricultural implements and made unfit for war. This demanded total disarmament, but not an absolute ban on weapons, because people need them for self-defense if the need should require it, but how they should also use these weapons as useful working tools. So it has been taught from time immemorial that earthly man should open his eyes and senses to the fact that he perceives and understands everything correctly, so that no rebellions, wars, and no terror bring harm to the present and the future. But religions and sects have not thought for the future since time immemorial, but only for the present, which is why they do not bring a long-term doctrine, such as the doctrine of truth, doctrine of the Spirit, doctrine of life. And since this is the case and religiously sectarian demands are made of man only for the moment and the present, without there being a comprehensive doctrine and decisive instructions for the journey, nothing can be learned and nothing can be given for the future and the behavior of people on their way. And as you are wont to say, through the religions and sects, learning is only a matter of threshing on empty straw so that not a single grain can be harvested. And you are more than right about this, because the so-called teachings of religions and sects do not correspond to any teachings, but only to empty phrases and empty phrases of a pointless kind, from which earthly man can learn nothing, but only fall into a delusion. This always lasts for life over all lives, because in relation to religions and sects, people are confronted again and again with the same aspects of faith and delusion. But if earthly authorities, politicians and rulers still practice and stir up war, earthly people, as individuals and as masses, should all the more clearly take the path of peace, so that all murderous means of attack and all degenerated weapon systems are smashed and destroyed. And this should also apply to the occult, religious, and sectarian practices of self-assurance which mislead and harass believers. The fact is that even through the religions, the righteous are equipped with the false work of peace and the word of peace, that only God is to be trusted, who gives victory to the righteous in war, etc. Peace is only secured where every armament and force of arms, as well as every coercion and every other force, are defensively discarded and no desire for war exists anymore. Even with regard to an assumed willingness to defend, for which a defensive army is designed to prevent wars, and consequently, despite pure defensive allure, there are warlike heirs. So where defensive armies exist, no real peace has yet been achieved, so the whole thing does not mean progress in terms of peace. Peace is only effectively possible where weapons have become productive devices, where there is no army to wage war or defensive war. Only when no man is taught anymore to wage wars and when no man is enemy of the other anymore can real peace come about.
The traditional promise of peace, which is proclaimed again and again, and which all peoples on earth are searching for and hoping will finally come about, is still completely unfulfilled. The peoples and their authorities still do not think in any way about orienting their decisions towards real peace. So earthly population is still a long way from following the path promised to everyone at the turn of the century from 1844 onwards, because contrary to earlier hopes, everything is unfortunately developing in the opposite way. The people of Earth do not use their weapons as effective instruments of peace, but as always for murder and manslaughter, because they do not stop learning war and declaring war to the so-called enemies. As ever, they are power-hungry and dictatorial, domineering and unpredictable in their greed and psychopathic moods. As a consequence of their greed for possession, power, and domination, they obviously cannot handle their decisions in mediation and judgment, so they constantly sharpen their swords to decapitate their supposed enemies and force them down with evil force. But the direction of the majority of earthly mankind is unambiguous, because for them there is no alternative to the task of widespread enmity with one another, and consequently also the majority of those in power and politicians work in the same anti-peaceful framework. As a result, they are all continuing to row towards the provision of modern weapons of human destruction, the majority of those in power, politicians, and the general human race itself. Working towards international legal agreements on disarmament and peace is always proclaimed to be urgent. But something really valuable is not being done in this regard, because if something is already achieved, then, on the one hand, only a few weapon systems will be reduced to a minimum, while on the other hand, all the alleged peace decisions are nothing but a farce because they are only fictitious acts of peace. And that has been so since time immemorial, which is why in the last 1,000 years there was only about 250 years of peace on Earth, but not in one piece, but over the millennium only in short months or weeks during which there had been no uprisings and wars, which adds up to about 250 years. Every killing of human beings is to be rejected and contradicts the creative natural laws and commandments, be it in the form of manslaughter, murder, terrorism, religious fanatic machinations of all kinds, by any form of insurrection, etc., or by death penalty. Basically, everything falls under murder, including armed self-defense. So the promise of peace among men and peoples, and also in relation to world peace, must be fulfilled in a non-violent way, through reason and understanding, love and charity, good and positive interpersonal relationships, friendships and enlightenment in relation to the creative natural laws and commandments and their fulfillment. And the universal prophet Nokodemion has already begun with this teaching, and his followers of personality, the prophets from his spirit line, have done the same as all the wise men who have ever walked earth. They have all at all times instructed men of earth, as individuals in themselves as well as among their peers, to keep peace together, and to proclaim it to all nations, and to carry it out into them. And if in this way the prophetic, denunciatory consciousness is spread and carried out into the future, so that the people of earth learn to understand peace and its meaning, then it can only be that one distant day, real peace will enter into every single person, into all peoples, and into the entire world population. But if the doctrine of truth, Doctrine of the Spirit, doctrine of life, and thus also the doctrine of peace do not work, then earthly mankind has a very bad and catastrophic future ahead of it, because all warlike and terrorist evils continue to bring all misery, all suffering, and ruin. This is because then people will continue to take their swords against people, and war and terror will reign unless the people of earth forge their swords into plowshares and their lances into sickles to cultivate the land peacefully. And it is doubtful that this will happen unless understanding and reason, love, peace, freedom, and harmony are finally created. And that this will be the case, and that it will get much worse, is proven by the events around the world today, which are becoming more brutal, inhuman, constantly more extensive, and more numerous from day to day. And this happens especially because people on Earth become more and more through overpopulation, who degenerate more and massacre each other conscientiously and senselessly, and treat each other like dirt. Consequently, already for large masses of overpopulation, a human life is no longer worth a chanterelle. Every man who is still able to perceive and understand reality and its effective truth can convince himself of this, namely whether he is completely uneducated and not able to speak, or whether he is educated and masters rhetoric. The fact is that from time immemorial, the three main religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, have not promised any popular or worldwide disarmament, but punishment and death through violence, war, and readiness for martyrdom. And this has been preserved to this day, although of course it is carried on in this way. And this is done by the majority of the authorities and politicians as well as by the religions and sects, even if they hypocritically preach peace and love. But bigotry has been a tradition since time immemorial, because it can mislead people and peoples, enslave them consciously, and exploit them in every conceivable evil way.
Contact Report 650.
We have detailed records of this, which lead back to the prophet Enoch and which also say exactly what you just said. The little more than 144,000 spirit forms of the then distant descendants from Nokodemion peoples, who immigrated to Earth about 13,500 years ago, exist at present partly in living personalities, which are scattered all over Earth practically in all peoples, whereby they usually live their lives individually. Today there are also a few small groups, but they are really very small and consist of only a few people and are concerned with the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life. These new personalities have come together in modern times, whose primeval ancestors came to Earth from foreign worlds at an early age, to form small groups from the 144,000 or so Nokodemion peoples, as a result of the missionary spread emanating from you and the Figu. Thus it is said that these small groupings have arisen from the ongoing mission efforts, whereby among these groupings there are of course not only personalities who come from the 144,000 or so former successors of Nokodemion, but there are also persons among them who possess pure earth-created spirit forms, following that they are pure earth humans. But also these, or at least a part of them, are oriented towards the creative natural laws and commandments as taught by the doctrine, and also with them everything happens apart from religions and sects. In any case, these are our findings, which we have arrived at as a result of our curiosity through clarifications and observations. And it must still be said that of course only a certain part of each of the 144,000 or so spirit forms enlivens new personalities who are in current lives, whereby we assume an estimate of about half in this respect. Also about this, there are exact details in our annals, which I have studied so I can answer your questions. First, the number of 144,000 people corresponds to a very early norm of an emigration power created by Nokodemion, which was usually led by 228 commanders, although there were seldom small exceptions, who, together with the emigration power, were under the command of an emigration Swiss. Such emigration powers were volunteers who idealistically agreed to spend the rest of their lives with early humans on other worlds, as well as on Earth, in order to teach them many helpful things about life management and development. For the first time, such an emigration force was sent out millions of years ago, followed by several more in 4 galaxies over all times, and thus also into the SOL system, and finally to Earth. The last one to Earth was sent according to earthly time calculation about 13,500 years ago, where the Nokodemion people emigrants on the one hand were to have an instructive effect on Earth humans, which they partly did, but on the other hand caused for the most part many calamities, especially with regard to rising up as deities and bringing religions into being. And they did so when they were smuggled into all earthly peoples and great tribal communities, whereby delusional beliefs in God developed among all peoples, tribes, and groups, etc. throughout the world, even among wild indigenous tribes. This led to the emergence of religions and sects, which expanded more and have survived to the present day and into the 3rd millennium, respectively, and will continue to do so for a very long time to come. All those of these extraterrestrial immigrants who remained on Earth also died there, and since then their spiritual forms have also reincarnated and will continue to reincarnate on Earth, precisely in ever new personalities of newly born Earth humans. So the 144,000 immigrants and their superiors and leaders were integrated worldwide as instructors into all existing earthly peoples and large tribes, as well as various groups in which they had to act as instructors. And like I said, many also fulfilled this obligation and thus led Earth humanity in technical, medical, and scientific regard on a higher level, however always in accordance with the possibilities prevailing at that time and also further on Earth. In this way, everything has been carried and developed since then up to the present time, consequently by the descendants of the old extraterrestrial immigrants from the Nokodemion descendants who came to Earth, who since then have been born again and again as new personalities and continue to be born, innovations in medicine and technology, etc., as well as new insights and expanded knowledge have been brought and continue to be brought. And many of these distant descendants of the former 144,000 Nokodemion descendants ethnic emigrants became and are, as a result of their evolution of consciousness and their abilities of various kinds transferred to them by their total conscious blocks, very talented in certain areas and powerful in this respect in progressive innovations, which are not yet possible for the pure Earth-created Earth-men. And such persons from the number of 144,000, as well as various others at other times, but also in the number of 144,000 each, were also the ones whom we, as the authoritative inventors, researchers, physicians, technicians, computer scientists, and scientists, etc., of certain areas on Earth, taught about knowledge, insights and developments, etc., in an apparatus impulse hypnotic manner, and without their knowledge, which was made possible for us by our directives. Therefore, when we committed ourselves to this teaching activity, we were only allowed to take care of the distant descendants of the former immigrants of the Nokodemion descendant peoples who were in active life. But we were not allowed to take care of any pure terrestrial human beings who existed from the ground up.
How often did the Nokodemion descendants of such emigration powers, each comprising 144,000 people, come to Earth? And what would also be of interest to me here would be the number of people who have finally remained on Earth and died there as a whole of these immigrants, so that they were born again on Earth as new personalities and continue to be born. It would really be very interesting to know this, if you have records of it.
Such records actually exist in our annals, some of which are directly attributed to the prophet Nokodemion, but also to his successors Hanok and Enoch. If for a moment, yes, here, yes. Our annals refer to a number of 8 different emigration powers of 144,000 persons each and 228 superiors each, who came to Earth in the course of more than 2 million years from the Nokodemion descendant peoples. And here is a total number of 151,828 people who were involved. Of these persons, 575,914 remained on Earth, died there, and are born again with their old reincarnating spirit forms as new personalities.
And these have been decisive since time immemorial with regard to all developments and great achievements of humanity on Earth, are also active in the modern age and will continue to be so in the future. Through their help, in the course of time, many pure Earth humans could also develop to a high level of knowledge and can. Consequently, a great deal of progress has been made for some time in all areas, and in every respect also by pure Earth humans, I think, isn't it?
That's true, but it's still mainly the reborn new personalities of the former Nokodemion descendants who are in the foreground.
Can I understand it? But how did it happen that 144,000 each agreed to give up their highly developed culture and live on Earth with early humans like Homo erectus?
On the one hand, they were pronounced idealists who were willing to provide development aid, so to speak, as is similarly the case on Earth, where such aid is provided for third world countries, etc. On the other hand, they were also very active in the field of development aid.
Then it kind of rubbed off on Earth humans.
You can say that. But on the other hand, there were also genetically manipulated refugees from the Sirius regions among the immigrants from the Nokodemion descendants, as well as fallible, that is to say, delinquents of the home planets, who preferred, instead of being sent into exile, which was applied in the most drastic and severe manner, to emigrate with such emigration powers and at liberty to teach early humans in the manufacture of various kinds of products, such as tools and hunting weapons, clothing and food containers, etc. Primitive art, music, and all kinds of knowledge were also taught to early man by these immigrants, as well as knowledge concerning the heavenly bodies, medicine concerning medicinal plants, etc., and the use of fire, etc.
And how and where were the distributions of these immigrant persons made among the early earthly human beings?
Small immigrant groups were formed, which were integrated into early human groups all over the world, while others joined early humans as loners or lived as their own small groups, which then also mixed with the early humans over time. In these forms, it was possible that mergers with the immigrants and the early humans could come about, which was, however, not always simple but often connected with fights, which also claimed deaths on both sides. But in the end, everything regulated itself in one way or another, so that the teachings could also take place and bear fruit.
So the whole thing was not easy, but therefore the actual creators of all progressive inventions of the early humans were to be led back to the immigrants of the Nokodemion descendants peoples. And this was the only reason why the humanity of today, which emerged from the early humans, could develop so drastically fast and as far as is the case today, with regard to electronics, inventions, craftsmanship, art, medicine, music and technology, etc., and so on. In principle, it would not have been possible without the direct immigrants from the Nokodemion peoples and without their distant descendants and all their teachings, as well as also without your apparatus impulse hypnotic influence of the descendants of the extraterrestrial immigrants that earthly mankind could develop so rapidly and to a large extent up to the today's conditions.
During the first millions of years and millennia, this was indeed the case. Of course, only in primitive developments of various things, for everything always had to be adapted to the corresponding state of consciousness of Earth humanity. This is because it was only possible to avoid an overdevelopment in every respect, because such an overdevelopment could not have been coped with by the Earth humans in terms of understanding and reason. The early extraterrestrial immigrants naturally had to, withhold their knowledge as well as their abilities and possibilities in every imaginable form, and to downgrade themselves in this respect in order not to overtax the early earthly humans who became known as Homo erectus through research in modern times, and also later the more highly developed earthly humans with excessive abilities, on the one hand, and on the other hand in order to adapt to them in every necessary way. However, the early Earth humans were very instructive, as are to some extent the Earth humans of today, but unfortunately not with regard to the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, and quickly learned the simple things, followed by a relatively fast development, and continued to do so. As a result, they also created advances, inventions, knowledge and developments, which have continued to behave in this way in all the long periods of time since then and have carried us into the future, even to the point of Homo sapiens, and also into the present time of Homo sapiens sapiens. So, in later times, the Earth humans who developed from it came from the Homo erectus, whereby, however, also various intermediate kinds developed from it, namely in the today's Asia areas as well as in Africa, whereby a very important basic origin was given in Europe, namely in the today's Germany, where a basic life form developed, from which in the end a human life form developed, which developed then, however, in the southern hemisphere completely. In the first beginnings, early humans were used as sexual partners by the first Nokodemion descendants, immigrants of peoples, so one has to say, whereby over a large number of generations several new human species arose, which are called Nephotwesen or Mischwesen in our annals. From these a new human species emerged, which is also known to earthly scientists as Denisova man, and which was an important factor in the further development of mankind on Earth, together with the Neanderthals and so on.
Well, then the question. The emigration troops have paired with the early Earthlings. Did modern people ultimately emerge from this? At that time, I think there was only Homo erectus. But then came the Denisova people, who our scientists already know, as you say.
This is not quite true, because the scientists are still in the process of clarifying and speculating and do not have any real knowledge in this respect. All they've got is some small fossils to speculate on.
You mean that they make hypotheses or simply assumptions and assumptions, because they have no actual proof of what, where, and from what kind of people the fossils originate?
Yes, it is.
Homo erectus was probably a clever fellow when I rhymed everything you said. Can you say something about that?
Homo erectus means the upright walking man. Basically, he was the first true Earth man who was a direct ancestor of the Neanderthals, and thus also the primeval ancestor of the actual Earth human of today. Homo erectus was, contrary to the false assertions of earthly researchers and scientists, about 2.7 million years ago, the successor of those first human beings who emerged from the first hominid primate-like beings, but who were not primates from the ground up, but first hominid beings, only that these looked wild and primate-like in their outward appearance, but had no reason whatsoever with primates. According to our research, the first of these species existed on Earth around 12 million years ago. Homo erectus emerged 2.7 million years ago from natural earthly hominid development, and it was also effectively the most successful hominid Earth ever produced. The first emigrating power and extraterrestrial visitors, who had already immigrated to Earth at that time, mixed early with the Homo erectus, who were still very wild, but nevertheless peaceful, pure Earth creatures. From this, a small new species developed from the genus Homo erectus, which was then also of very long existence, increased further, and from which also still another new species developed. Most of the extraterrestrial visitors, however, left Earth and did not return. After that, about 1,000,000 years ago and also afterwards, 4 more emigration powers came to Earth, of which a small number remained while the majority left again. Then, 389,000 years ago, the 144,000 more immigrants of the distant descendants of the Nokodemion descendants, who also mixed worldwide, like all other immigrants, with pure terrestrial human beings, came, as you mentioned, 144,000 more immigrants. From all these, and in mixture with other hominid forms of development Earthman Homo sapiens sapiens, living today, emerged in the end since primeval times, actually as a very far-developed Homo erectus, who is to be called the actual direct primeval ancestor of Earthman. Furthermore, it is a fact that, with respect to Homo erectus, this was not a hairy early man monstrosity that simply ran wildly swinging a club around and knocked down anything that got in his way. The Homo erectus did not just growl and make any dull noises either, because in fact it was already able to articulate itself understandably. So the early ancestor of the terrestrial man was different in this respect from the false views of terrestrial researchers. Homo erectus already had a lot of abilities very early on through the teachings of the extraterrestrial visitors, for example with regard to the production and use of fire. He was also not simply a cave dweller, even if there were such exceptions, because he effectively built huts for his own use, made hunting weapons and tools, partly cooked his food and built boats for water, etc., all through the teachings of the extraterrestrial immigrants. And these abilities, along with many others, which Homo erectus had learned through the immigrants, he also passed on to his descendants, whereby these values have been preserved up to the present time in the terrestrial human being, and have, moreover, been extraordinarily extended in terms of development. Already at the first time of its existence, Homo erectus was very adaptable and comparatively peaceful, which has been preserved to this day in those terrestrial humans who are not affected by the hereditary gene manipulation of the X chromosome caused by the Syrians.
Unfortunately, it is likely that the mixing of human beings and the very early growth of earthly mankind has led to the genetic manipulation of the X chromosome spreading across the entire Earth, with the spread of heredity becoming more and more blatant as a result of the ever-growing overpopulation and the evil of more and more wars, strife, lack of freedom and disharmony, etc. arising.
That's how it can be explained and seen, yes.
If I may go back to it, you said that according to your estimates about half of the 144,000 people in modern times would be in active lives. Do I simply have to start from those who came to Earth about 13,500 years ago? Or do I also have to include the retards of the other and former emigration powers?
Our estimates refer to all those left behind of all emigration powers. That is to say, to the known number of 575,914 of all emigration powers of 151,128 persons, whereby, according to our calculations in modern times, and thus also at present, approximately 287,707 personalities are in active life on Earth, whereby the majority of them work in many important fields and only very few are of minor importance. We cannot exactly determine the exact number because we do not yet have any possibilities to fathom the state of consciousness very precisely.
And all these about 287,707 personalities are distributed practically in all peoples of Earth, if I have understood correctly, right?
That is true, and we include in it the constant change that results from the change of deaths and births.
Thank you. Then we will finally have clarity in this respect as to how everything has happened. This also refutes the weak-headed assertion of those lunatics who swear that humanity on Earth was created by extraterrestrials, such as the Raelian sect and other sects spread this nonsense.
Extraterrestrials have in very early and also in more recent times only interfered in the development of the ancient terrestrial early human beings, which is why they have played certain determining roles in this respect and have also brought calamity to the earth. This, too, in the wise of their mating and mixing with the terrestrial early humans' beings, and so bringing the Syrian genetic manipulation to the earth. The latter has then spread on a large scale among the earthly humankind by way of heredity and has, through aggression, disharmony, jealousy, wars, murders, manslaughter, unpeace and unfreedom, etc., brought a great deal of calamity and has preserved it up to the present time. But so this did not happen as a result of a creation of earth humans by extraterrestrials and alleged Elohim, etc., by extraterrestrial immigrants who mated and mixed with the early herd people. On the one hand, only the Syrian gene manipulation and other gene transfers caused by race were spread worldwide by inheritance. And on the other hand, already early, the generally all-encompassing and at that time possible primitive development was promoted in various relations. Only in these forms did the extraterrestrial immigrants of all times make reference to the terrestrial human beings, but never in such a way that terrestrial humanity was created by them, extraterrestrials. So the effective truth is that humanity on Earth has emerged as its own creation from the development of life forms on Earth itself, although certain genetic factors of extraterrestrial immigrants have remained in it from the early days of early earthly humans and also from later times, as well as Syrian gene manipulation in large parts.
And that you play, Aaron, through your teachings, try to do something against the misconduct and the mischief of the old extraterrestrial immigrants. Just by teaching and informing, you consider this simply as your obligation, because the old immigrants belong to the Nokodemion descendant peoples, just like you play, Aaron. That's the point, isn't it?
That's so, yes.
Then this will also be discussed and clarified. But then there is another question open, and that is the one I asked Florina to submit to you and to look for the corresponding interview report. It was then, when Quetzal spoke at the beginning of the 1980s about which new group members would join the Figu and what would partly arise in their private sphere and thus also in the Figu. This private conversation would be important for me, because I was asked again and again, and just recently more often, that it had been said that and would form an alliance with each other, although I declared early in the 1980s that, according to Quetzal, you had made a foresight in this regard, which discouraged such an alliance. At that time, according to Quetzal's statements, I said that this alliance or relationship between, and as well as others, because a catastrophe in terms of a psychic conscious form would result, both in terms of, and, which would have to be considered as possibly killing itself one day.
Contact Report 654.
Just thought you might have something special you might want to bring up. All right then. Look here. That's what I've written here. Why I need your help to answer the reader's question correctly. And I think other bulletin readers are interested as well. I think it is necessary to explain when, how, and why the values of the spiritual teachings were integrated into the confused Buddhist teachings. Well then, the reader's question first. Question.
You have written in your books and writings that of earthly religions Christianity, Buddhism and Islam only a few explanations, and explanations, are acceptable and correct. Can you explain this in more detail, just how it must be understood? E. Friedrich, Germany. My answer.
My expressions that in earth religions, Buddhism, Christianity and Islam only certain few parts are acceptable and correct, refer only to values such as those given according to the ancient teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life, respectively, doctrine of the mind, respectively, teaching of the prophets of the primordial prophet Nokodemion. In this respect, However, only few values are contained in the Buddhist, Christian, and Islamic religious teachings, whereby these in no way trace back to these religions themselves, but to Nokodemion's teachings or spiritual teachings.
Billy.
In my opinion, it would now be necessary for you to be more specific about how everything has turned out. You have already explained the whole thing to me once in a private conversation, but I think that you could repeat and explain what was explained to me at that time in short form, because everything is more familiar to you than to me.
Yeah, I can do that. The spiritual teaching has brought two old Lyran, distant descendants from the emigration power, that came to Earth 13,500 years ago as emigrants 2,1091 Earth years ago to the eastern part of Earth, respectively to a larger group of Earth humans who lived in a mountainous region of the country today called Burma, respectively Myanmar Notebili, formerly Bama, Burma, Myanmar. This group, which comprised 309 female and male Earth humans, formed a small order with an educational institution, which secretly lasted until the beginning of the 20th century. This group was able to survive into the modern age through constant descendants, but various members migrated from the community, mainly to the areas of northern India at that time. From 1814, however, the group began to slowly die out as a result of increasing deaths, and by 1850, the group had grown to 32 people of different ages. So it has to be said repeatedly that nearly 2,900 years ago, a small secret order with a small educational institution was founded in the former area of today's Burma, where the spiritual doctrine was taught, whereby this order existed until 1917, nearly 2,900 years. From 1856, my father Svath maintained contact with the senior leader of the order for about 50 years, whom he often visited and whom he also taught in Satipatthana meditation. The small order at that time still comprised 4 persons, of whom the leader of the order died in 1907, followed by the remaining 3 persons of the order who were also very old, and thus the secret order came to an end. The then instructed earthlings of the mentioned group, which initially comprised 309 persons, spread the teachings brought to them among their peers on the one hand, but on the other hand also by some leaving their homeland and going the way to the then Nepal, respectively, North India, where they also spread the learned, but with only little success. Nevertheless, the spiritual doctrine has also spread there partly among a group of interested people and has been preserved for about 530 years, whereby the followers of the doctrine called themselves Bodhi, for the sake of the doctrine and the change to the enlightened and awakened human being, which means enlightened and awakened. The teaching was received and then also learned by Siddhartha Gautama, that is to say, Siddhartha Gautama, but was not understood by him and transformed at his own discretion into a completely strange and unrealistic, false teaching, whereby he integrated various good values of the spiritual teaching into his fantasy teaching. So it is to be understood that the values of the spiritual doctrine, which are partly listed in the Buddhism religion, do not refer to the well-known Buddhism, which was founded about 6 centuries before Emmanuel Croar, by Siddhartha Gautama and spread worldwide as a teaching tradition and religion. This teaching tradition and religion, however, are not much better than any other religion with its heresies and fantasies, because they are far from any reality and truth.
So it is clear that what I have written about the good and positive in Buddhism does not mean the confused teaching of Siddhartha Gautama, and not the well-known Buddhism itself, which has between 350 and 500 million followers worldwide, and which is especially widespread in China, Bhutan, Japan, Cambodia, Laos, Mongolia, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Korea, Thailand, Tibet, and Vietnam. My remarks and explanations basically refer to Buddhism enlightened, awakened, which was taught to a larger group of people in the north of early Burma as the doctrine of truth, the doctrine of the spirit, the doctrine of life, or the teaching of the spirit, or the teaching of the prophets, and which is no longer widely taught today because there are no longer any followers of Buddhism.
Contact Report 657.
Yes, then here's what you can write. Special procedure, special information for the explanations, statements and explanations regarding the spiritual teaching mission, which Billy Edgeworth Albert Meyer fulfills as a life task, is based on the ancient spiritual teaching, respectively, the teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the life. In the past, this teaching has been taught and brought to earth by 6 followers of Nokodemion, the original Ur proclaimer, in the course of thousands of years on earth. In the origin of this mission, the 6 announcers were designated for different periods of the last 13,500 years, and the last for modern times, to come into life in 1937 and to bring and teach the spiritual teaching once again and for the last time to terrestrial mankind. All this also happened, whereby the beginning of the mission and the instruction and care for the still young proclaimer took place from 1937 under the honorable protection of the elderly Playaran Svath. So inquarshi norcharis sanyar cried so. Later by Asket from the Dal universe, and then more recently since 1975 by Ishrish Simyase. Later, until 1989, Ishwish Quetzal instructed and protected me, then Ishwish Shrut Ptah of the Playaran, and I continued this task until the last day of the modern-day proclaimer. Through me, Ptah, and my mediation on the level of High Council, a special mental procedure enabled the modern-day proclaimer to make a mental connection to the pure spirit level of Arahat Athirseta, through which ancient knowledge could be transmitted to him. This has provided him with information through which he could and can get directly to the memory banks of the universal Nokodemion, which enables him to obtain information that can be traced back directly to Nokodemion. All information concerning the knowledge of the universal proclaimer Nokodemion could and can only be obtained by a laborious procedure, which only results from the fact of his proclaimerhood, or because he is the 7th proclaimer of the Nokodemion lineage on Earth. Only by this fact of the mental form conditioned connection with the Nokodemion line it was and is possible for it to see the memory banks of Nokodemion and to call up all information necessary and important for it, particularly in connection with its denunciation mission, to decipher and use. Nokodemion and he, like me, Ptah, received via the pure spirit level Arahat Athirsata information from the high spirit level, Patah Li, as the proclaimer of modern times himself through or via the mediation of Arahat Athirsata to the Patah Li level, also received special teachings, as well as the transmission of 2 books, which he had to receive and write medially. This is also true with regard to various teachings given to him, which, among other things, refer to the nothing or absolute nothing vacuum and the process of condensation that took place through the vacuum nothing, from which a bipolar negative-positive impulse arose and led to the creation of the sine absolutum. Similarly, one of the teachings also applies to the data concerning the time calculation of the time canon, etc., but also with regard to the teaching of the Spirit, or teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life. Comprehensive teachings were given. However, the spiritual teaching was already created billions of years ago by the universal prophet Nokodemion and his again and again incarnated new personalities, and in the last consequence brought to earth in order to be taught and spread there over thousands of years by the 7 prophets, for the last time in the modern times. 14th August 2016, Ishvish Shrutpata of the Playaran.
Contact Report 658 Spirit and Consciousness.
The spirit is a purely creative energy with tremendous power, through which man is enlivened, like any form of life at all. The spirit, which has nothing to do with the consciousness of man or other life forms, corresponds to a pure creative energy and power, which is directly connected with the creation of universal consciousness and with all its energy and power. In contrast to consciousness and its energy and power, the spirit is immortal and classified as continuing to exist, and that until a distant time a remelting with the creation of universal consciousness or with the creation energy takes place. In contrast to consciousness, whose activity and energy can be measured technically and electronically, spirit energy and spirit power cannot be measured. The spirit or spirit form of man and other life forms is classified as reincarnation or rebirth, which is not the case for consciousness and its energy and power. The human spirit or spirit energy collects knowledge from the human consciousness impulsively and accumulates it into wisdom or impulse-impregnated energy. So everything happens purely in terms of impulse energy, and therefore has nothing to do with thoughts or thinking, as it is peculiar to consciousness alone. As a result of the inability of people at Emmanuel's time, wrongly called Jesus Christ, to understand many concepts, such as consciousness, the traditional and widespread term spirit was used, which has survived to this day and creates a tremendous misunderstanding and confusion. Emmanuel was aware that the term spirit did not correspond to correctness, but due to the incomprehension of the people of that time, he could not use the correct term consciousness. So he had no choice but to use the term spirit to explain the values of the teaching of the prophets or the teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the life and the meaning and value of the prayers. And since the term spirit was understood by people at that time as that, and is still understood today, what happens and is done through consciousness, that thoughts are cultivated, actions and ideas are conceived and carried out, inventions are made, poems are rhymed and written, works are conceived and created, etc. So it resulted with the word spirit, that it was understood what just had to be understood. And exactly this is still the case today with the ignorant human beings of the earth. Therefore the term spirit is still understood in the old sense as that which is accomplished in every respect by consciousness. In fact, however, it is not the spirit that is the crucial factor for everything, such as thoughts, ideas, inventions, etc., but only the consciousness of man, for only this is directed towards being intellectually active. However, the fact that in ancient times the term spirit was used instead of the term consciousness did not in itself constitute an obstacle, because if the creative spirit was used in a human being or in a human being, it would not be an obstacle. The creative human spiritual form is addressed by man himself, whether in a simple self-communicative form or with regard to a prayer in expressive devotion. Then in earthly human sense that is addressed, which is fundamentally and correctly the consciousness by which a guideline is given, by which something particular is to come about or is to be done by man himself. So the whole thing also works in this way, even though the wrong term spirit is understood as something completely wrong, and the consciousness has to be understood fundamentally, but what is usually not known and not conscious to the people of Earth. It is, however, as a result of misunderstanding that, without man knowing it, the consciousness is automatically addressed by the response of the spirit, because there is a direct energy connection between the spiritual form and the consciousness. Because only through the spiritual energy, which corresponds to a subtle spirit electromagnetic energy, the human consciousness is functional. The seat of the creative human spirit, that is to say the spiritual form, is located in the roof of the midbrain. Paired node. Colliculus superior, whereby the spirit, that is to say the spiritual form, is only the factor of the animation of the consciousness with its whole personality block, but also filigree distributed in and over the whole body, and thus also every organ. As such a factor, The spirit does not exercise trains of ideas and thoughts, etc., but only impulses, because the function of thinking, ideas, and conceptions, etc., is reserved solely for consciousness. Thus, it is an irrational teaching to speak of spiritual property, etc., because since the spirit develops neither ideas nor thoughts and feelings, because only consciousness is capable of it, and this is reserved for it alone, spiritual property cannot exist, but consciousness property can. So equally, no spirit illness and no spirit confusion, etc., can appear, because the creative human spirit, that is to say, the spiritual form, is given out of creation as a part of tiny creation, spirit, energy, universal consciousness, and is absolutely untouchable by man in every imaginable way. The consciousness, however, can be manipulated in opposite ways by humans, and can also be damaged and ill by any damage, such as accident or illness, mental or hidden overload, or by alcohol, drugs, gases, or environmental influences, etc., which can result in damage to consciousness and consciousness diseases, etc. But it is never possible that spirit damage and spirit illness, etc., can appear, because the spirit of man, like that of any other form of life, cannot be influenced or harmed by man in any way. The spirit, which provides the actual life energy and life force for man, cannot be influenced in any way that is harmful or harmful to him, because it is absolutely taboo or uncontrollable, unmanipulable and uncontrollable for man and for all other forms of life, in complete contrast to consciousness, which is controllable, steerable, manipulable, and controllable. Well, first the term spirit, that is to say its original term, geest, is to be explained, which originally leads back to the universal herald Nokodemion and is to be found in the memory banks, whereby in these also the meaning awakening can be found. So if we are talking about creative spirit energy, for example, then this means creative awakening energy. From this it can be understood that creation or the creation spirit, also called creation universe spirit energy, because creation is the universe, and thus the total energy and power, is a factor of awakening or creating, namely through the power, vibrations, and impulses of its own energy. Only in this sense is the term spirit and spirit energy to be understood. An encore in the memory, Banks explains that the term has been handed down since time immemorial, consistently up to the old language German, from which the German language ultimately originated. When the linguistic tribe German was pushed into the background, the original term Geest underwent various changes, whereby in the end the term was formed into the word spirit. During the whole process of change, the meaning of the term was lost and was explained with shuddering, frightening and arousing, etc., only to be mixed up in recent times with religious and sectarian ideas of a God spirit, which also in Greek is pneuma and in Latin spiritus, etc., found admission. The spirit, for example, has also been linked to a soul up to the expectation of the hereafter, and to this day it often includes spiritual assumptions with regard to a pure or absolute, transpersonal or even transcendent spirituality, which is not bound to the corporeal body but has an effect on it, and which was created by a god or is equal to or identical with it, if not identical with it. In the Christian imagination, on the other hand, even a Holy Spirit is understood as a person, symbolically as a dove, or as an eye represented Spirit of God. The term spirit, in general, has also found its way into the linguistic usage of man of earth in other ways, whereby very strange blossoms are produced with it. For example, since time immemorial, and up to the present time, the consciousness of man has been mistakenly understood as spirit, and consequently it is addressed with the term spirit, as for example in a prayer, This in itself can be accepted and left as such, because correctly it always addresses one's own consciousness and encourages valuable activity, even if man does not know this in his ignorance, and neither knows nor understands the whole of the effective difference and value in relation to spirit and consciousness. It is wrong, however, to associate the term spirit with a deity and with the delusion of God, because in this case, man stupidly tries to connect with something imaginary and non-existent, instead of addressing his own consciousness through his thoughts and his will and consciously influencing and controlling it with regard to his needs, desires, ideas and desires, etc., in order to do and achieve what he wants. Furthermore, man of earth uses in the wrong way the term spirit also for his power of thought and for his intellect, as well as erroneously in linguistic ways such as, his spirit has become confused, his spirit is disturbed, he is spiritually ill, great spirits, he's not a great spirit, a man with an alert, active or slow spirit, he has spirit, a spirited book, etc. It also refers to the totality of thoughts and ideas, as well as to the fact that an event is experienced again in the spirit or seen in front of one in the spirit. An attitude or conviction is also associated with the spirit. Also, the expressions of life and the spirit of the, or a time, etc., are misused, although the spirit has nothing to do with all these things and factors, because in each case only the consciousness is responsible for it. Other completely false forms can also be found in the speeches concerning brandy from fermented fruits and berries, etc., such as strawberry spirit, etc. The term spirit is also mistakenly used to refer to people with regard to certain qualities and abilities, to the effect they exert, as well as it is the good spirit of the house. You are a troubled spirit, a ministering spirit, etc. Finally, the term spirit is mistakenly also used for allegedly returning deceased revenants, vampires, as well as for figure-like ghostly appearances of the dead. In some places and in popular belief, natural beings in human form are also called earth spirits or air spirits, but also alleged supernatural beings, ghosts, and, as already mentioned, the Holy Spirit, the spirit of darkness with the devilish spirit. It continues with the belief in spirits, in an evil or good spirit, as well as with the saying, "Have you been abandoned by all good spirits?" Things and states, etc., that have nothing to do with it, such as how, are wrongly called spirit or spirit-related, etc. Intelligence, chosenness, pardon, ability to comprehend, character, imagination, sensation, insight, experience, knowledge, specialist, feeling, scholarship, cleverness, greatness of mind, spiritual power, spiritual strength, mind, genius, attitude, humor, ideas, individuality, inner life, inner world, inner being, instinct, wisdom, luminosity, mother-wit, nature, creativity, joie de vivre, light, phenomenon, personality, productivity, psyche, talent, perspicacity, acumen, cunning, quick-wittedness, creative spirit, creative soul, specialist, judgment, predisposition, vision, delusion, wisdom, far-sightedness, being, wit, nature, etc. Some human beings on the earth think that the spirit is the brain, while others think that some other part or function of the body, such as consciousness, is to be called the spirit. However, this is fundamentally wrong, because the brain is purely physical material in nature, and consciousness is anchored in it. The brain itself is something that can be seen with the eyes when it is exposed, but can also be viewed from the outside by apparatus Urel or measured with electromagnetic probes in its activity. So it can be photographed, analyzed, and operated on. This, while consciousness cannot be determined in this way, because it represents a subtle function of the brain, and its activity can possibly only be measured electronically. Contrary to the brain, the spirit is not of a material nature, but of the finest material nature, and therefore much more subtle than the subtle consciousness which exercises a partial function in the brain. And since the spirit is of the finest material nature, it cannot be observed, seen, or registered in any other way by any apparatus or devices, nor with the eyes. So he can neither be photographed nor attacked, damaged or treated by an operation by physical, internal, or external circumstances, nor by thoughts, feelings, illness, accident, drugs, poisons, or medications, etc. So the brain is not the spirit, but this is simply only a part of the body, and within it there is nothing that can be identified as spirit, except the spirit itself, which is located in the roof of the midbrain, molled, paired nodal point. Colliculus superior, as the smallest part of creation spirit, but which cannot be effectively determined by apparatus, etc. Thus, the whole body and the brain and consciousness of man, as well as the mind, are fundamentally different entities, which are fundamentally different in nature, both in their gross and in their subtle nature. And if we look at consciousness, which is a function of the brain, then it can be extremely busy and active, for example, through thoughts, and jump from one object to another, while the body remains completely relaxed and motionless. The spirit itself is not affected in any way, for it is not identical with consciousness, but it is the creative energy factor that enlivens consciousness, which also drives the body and all its functions. This clearly states that consciousness, body, and brain are absolutely not of the same nature as spirit. In the Nokodemion memory banks, I learned a word about the difference between the spirit and the human being that clearly shows that the human spirit is a tiny part of the human spirit of creation. Thus, the human body can be compared with the human being, for example, by comparing the human body with an inn where the spirit lingers as a guest, where it also nourishes itself and pays for it. But if the inn is torn down or otherwise destroyed, then the spirit, who is the guest, leaves the place of destruction. Applied to man, this means that the spirit lives and learns in him as a guest, receives food and lodging, and at the same time enlivens the entire body, pays for food and lodging. And when man dies, the spirit immediately escapes from the body and passes into his afterlife area, only to be bound to it again in the next new personality in the next life, and to be a new guest in the new human body. So the spirit is not the brain, just as it is not any other part of the human body. It must be understood as a formless continuum in the roof of the midbrain, Marshas paired node, common colliculus superior of humans. And because the spirit is by nature formless or immaterial, it cannot be touched or hugged, it cannot be ill, nor can it be hindered or damaged by any material object or by human intervention. So it is very important to understand that there are no unpeaceful or peaceful states of spirit, for such states are reserved solely for human consciousness. Only unpeaceful or peaceful or morbid states can appear only in consciousness, which can disturb or lift up inner peace, because only consciousness, through thoughts and feelings, is capable of creating rage, envy, and desirous attachment, delusions, or valuable peaceful states, because the spirit itself behaves in every way absolutely neutral and does not interfere in consciousness matters. Man alone is therefore responsible in every respect for the well-being and woe of his consciousness, so that he is always responsible for all his emotions and mental emotional suffering, but not his spirit, nor other human beings or bad social, material or social circumstances, etc. Truthfully, all such ailments are caused by blinded and pathological states of consciousness, as well as false states of consciousness, in which thoughts and feelings play a very important role. The most important point in understanding consciousness is that liberation from the above-mentioned sufferings cannot be found outside of it, but only within it and in thoughts and feelings. Constant liberation cannot be found through the spirit, but only through the purification of consciousness, thoughts, and feelings. Therefore, if man wants to be free from consciousness, thought, feel, psychological suffering as well as from problems and worries, and if he wants to find lasting peace, freedom, and harmony, and an everlasting inner happiness, he must deepen his knowledge and understanding of consciousness. It is impossible for man to locate and track down the human spirit, at least at the present time, because he has neither the necessary equipment nor the abilities nor any other means to track down and measure the spirit energy. The human spirit or spirit form cannot be seen by man because the pure creative spirit energy cannot be perceived or felt by the human eye. There are also no apparatuses or analytical devices, etc., not even in the field of ultraviolet or infrared, which would make it possible to make the spirit or the spiritual form or the creative spirit energy visible or measurable at all. Nor is it possible for any particular state of consciousness to see the spirit or the spiritual form, because the spiritual energy is as invisible as the pure air. The spirit or spirit form of man is purely creative, energetic in nature, and has nothing to do with consciousness, nor with the brain waves that can be perceived and measured. Since time immemorial, consciousness has erroneously been called the spirit of man, but the spirit is completely different in nature from consciousness. The spirit, that is to say, the spiritual form of man, is purely creative, while consciousness is a factor of man, his brain, and responsible for the fact that thoughts can be created from it, whereby also the whole ratio emerges from it, thus also understanding and reason. The spirit, on the other hand, is only the creative and natural energy that animates the consciousness and the human body. When the spirit leaves the human body, it escapes into its afterlife plane, which exists in the same space as the present reality of the planet, whereby the so-called afterlife plane is dimensioned differently from the real material reality space, namely in the finest material, spiritual, energetic nature. In relation to the planet, then, the plane beyond is arranged around it, just as this plane continues to exist universe-wide, but in relation to the material plane of reality in a subtle, material plane to which man as a material form of life has no access whatsoever, and consequently cannot see or perceive anything and cannot communicate with the other. So in this plane it is impossible for a person to see or otherwise perceive the spirit or the spiritual form that has escaped from the material body, or to somehow communicate with it. The fact that the otherworldly realm of the planet is arranged in a different dimension than the real material space of reality, not only in this space, but also in the entire universe, has its justification. Thus it follows from the spiritual teachings that when a planet is destroyed, or simply becomes unviable, then the existing spirit forms and other unused spirit energies on it are not destroyed, but are migrated to move through the world space until a new planet is found on which human life exists. On this planet the spirit forms, or spirit energies, then settle again, mix with already existing ones there, and reach again or further into a cycle of reincarnation or rebirth. Sim Ya Say, Silver Star Center, 25th August 2016. Ik own 15 cars. Billy.